Welcome to Candid Conversations with Dr. Mayfield. This episode is sponsored by Mayfield Counseling Centers, helping you find clarity, hope, and purpose. Call us at 719-452-4803. Here's your host, Trever Shayne.
Welcome back to Candid Conversations. We are continuing our conversation around race and racism. I am joined in the studio with Dr. Mayfield and Shayne Stuart, a therapist at Mayfield Counseling. How are you guys this morning?
Doing good. Thanks for having me again.
Can't complain. It's a beautiful day outside.
Sure is.
Well, Shayne, we're grateful to have you back. This is such an essential conversation for us to be having, especially as we're trying to dig deeper into some things that are very divisive in our society today, learning how to talk about these things well and appropriately in a way that, one, doesn't step on toes or offend, but also allows us to learn and to grow as individuals. And I think that last week, talking about the microaggressions and seeing color and what that means, I think was really important. And I'm excited for what we have to talk about this week. Dr. Mayfield, you have a couple questions that you wanted to start us off with.
Well, yeah, I was really thinking about this idea of, and Trevor, you said it this morning, is that, we want to have these conversations so we don't offend. And I'm wondering, maybe it's okay to offend sometimes. I think we get so complacent in what we think we know or we don't know, especially around this topic. And sometimes, we do this in counseling all the time, right? Where we poke a little bit, we prod, we direct, we confront with our clients, and it elicits a genuine emotion. Right. And I'm wondering, Shayne, from your perspective, maybe is it okay to offend a little bit?
It's very funny that we're actually talking about this, because I was kind of wondering, how some conversations will go, and not one of them was going to be flawless. There's going to be times we're going to offend each other just because of what we know, what we think we know, what we don't know, and how to best bring all of those things and so much more to the table with this type of conversation. So there's going to be times in where, absolute offense will happen just because of where we're coming from and what we bring to the table. So I definitely believe there's got to be a level of grace of these conversations, because without that, we're absolutely going to go ahead and be back to pointing fingers and you did this, you did that, and you said this. No, if we're coming to the table to actually have true and honest conversations on this topic and so much more, we have to allow people to be people, and there's going to be mistakes, there's going to be misunderstandings, and these conversations can be an avenue to clear a lot of those things up. So I almost would say that I would want there not to be offense, not to want to have offense, but to actually hear how some people perceive things in an accurate way, and bringing those things out so I can help clear some of those things up.
And I think that's the big point that you put there is we have to push forward in these conversations, and if we're not used to it, or we've never been trained in that, or just never been exposed to having difficult conversations, when we try, we might misstep, or we might say something wrong, or do and so that there could be offense. But I think the alternative is even worse.
Right?
Would you agree? Like not talking about it, not pursuing it.
Well, and I wanted to ask about political correctness. We have this in our society, and we're told that this is the way to speak and this is the way not to. Does that help these conversations, or does it maybe hinder them?
If there's a healthy level of it, but today's society has gotten so much that the pendulum has swung so far the other way. There has to be some level of it. We don't want to be downright offensive. That's just not going to work. But we also have to scale it back to, there's got to be some sort of middle ground with it. In order, just like I said, just to truly understand the other person, that curiosity, which we spoke about last time. If it's curiosity, if it's healthy curiosity, then yes, stick with me in the conversation. I'll do my best to stick with you in the conversation and see how we can get better understanding and more towards not necessarily an exact center. I don't believe there's no such thing as an exact center with these type of conversations, but at the very least, we can have these conversations, and even if we disagree with each other, we can disagree in a good way. at least if there's some understanding in the midst of it, we can get further along, especially with these kind of conversations.
Yeah. And I know that we've talked, and as we've gotten to know each other, I don't think we've ever offended each other. No. I think it's always been a curiosity and growth piece.
Absolutely.
But one of the things I know that we've talked about a lot is the fact that you're in an interracial marriage, and so, it's not only is are we talking about microaggressions and race against people of color and that kind of stuff, but you also have talked to me about the fact that that in and of itself, even though I know your wife and she's a wonderful woman, that puts you into a different level of shall I say scrutiny or questioning.
It definitely does. As a matter of fact, shout out to my wife, by the way. Hi, Megan. Love you. Have to put that out there. Absolutely. But yes, these conversations can be had honestly and earnest through relationships, friendships with each other. And there's no greater intimate relationship than marriage. And so Megan and myself, we have these conversations sometimes. I won't even say sometimes, I would say a lot of times. Just from where she comes from. She comes from the Midwest, where there is, of course, some African Americans out there, but definitely not as much as from where I come from in the East Coast in New York City. So she has some ideas as far as race, multiculturalism. I have some ideas about it, and when we sit down and talk about it, there tends to be an implosion of thought, of curiosity, of understanding. But I will also go ahead and say there are times in where we've sat across from each other and we don't quite get it or understand. We come to some roadblocks, and we've had to fight through and struggle through some of those understandings to be able to, of course, better relate with each other and where we each come from, but also for our children who are biracial. And so what type of world are they in now, and what type of world will they be growing up in, and where their identity comes from, and how they will engage the world from their own different culture and where they're coming in. So yeah, we've had these hard conversations, and I wish I could say they all ended up in roses and butterflies. They have not.
Well, and I think that's super important for us to hear that even in your marriage, there are conversations that don't always go perfectly. They on this subject. And so for us to go into a conversation with just a friend,
right,
even if it's a very close friend, we need to understand that there are going to be those circumstances, those conversations that don't go the way we wish they had or expected them to. And that's okay.
It absolutely is okay. And if I can add just a different piece with that, an additional piece with that, it's through our relationship that we've pushed through those hard times. And I think that is a huge piece with these conversations. There's going to be pitfalls. There's going to be some chasms, a divide in understanding. But if we get to a point of trying to honestly push through some of these things and not just immediately walk away from the table with our own belief on it, then we can have greater understanding. A lot of folks are not in a place, or at least from what I've seen from different places, to want to push through that. They have the curiosity, but do they have the vigor? Do they have the centeredness within self to go ahead and actually push through some of these harder topics? Because it's very difficult at times.
Well, I can only imagine too that the motivation behind it as well. And right. And I'm wondering, just in your lifetime, you're a retired military, you've done a lot to get to where you're at. And I wonder too that if you've come across relationships in your life where there is the curiosity, but the motivation is misplaced.
Yes, I would definitely say, especially in the military, I'll just say from the military, in my opinion, there's no greater institution that has a breadth of multiculturalism, but from the last time where we talked as well about having some friends who are separatists at times, I experienced most of that within the military as well. And so there are a good bit of individuals that do have the curiosity but don't know where to start.
Sure.
And then you have individuals that have the curiosity, but their motivation levels switch and change depending upon work relationships and additional other things. And so, you have that grand difference at times, and it's almost a moving target.
And I think it's important to take into account safe places. We talked about that previously on this podcast, that there's a time, but there's also a place to have some of these conversations. And perhaps if you're, working at a McDonald's and behind the cash register as customers are coming through, that's probably not the best place and time to have that conversation.
Hey, so where you coming from? And by the way, can you get my fries? No.
That would be a little awkward, I think. And so I don't want to speed through, the conversation about your marriage and those those pieces. And I wonder if there's anything else that you would like to add about that. I have another question I'd like to ask, but I want to make sure that you've been able to express that, because it's very important. And I've watched you guys in your marriage, and just wonderful how it plays out.
You know what? If concerning this particular topic, I would say that I have grand evidence to say that it's worth it. The conversations are worth it. Howsoever hard or not as hard these conversations between my wife and I have been, it has shown me a grand level of importance, and that it's worth having if you're wanting to go ahead and push through it, if you're willing to push through it. Absolutely.
Well, I appreciate that, Shayne, and I think you and Megan present a really neat model of that the desire behind it, and then also the modeling of what that looks like. So I appreciate that. I'm going to ask a question that might lead us into a part 3 of this series. But as I've been sitting here talking and just remembering our conversations over the last year or so, one of the things that we haven't talked about that I think kind of goes hand in hand with because you are retired military,
yes,
right? And you are also very passionate about these conversations. And I think the two can go hand in hand. But one of the things that our society has been confronted with over this last year is the whole national anthem protest. And I know you and I have had very, very good conversations around that, and you've opened my eyes to some things that I didn't consider, and so I'm throwing a can of worms out there, and we might need to add a third part to this, but we've talked about Colin Kaepernick and his motivation, and I know I've got friends that are probably going to be listening to this that were very much against that, because that in some ways, whether they had a good reason or not, or kind of jumped on the bandwagon from a media standpoint or a Republican standpoint, or however you want to throw that out there. And I know I'm just throwing out a lot of key trigger words, but let's talk a little bit about that, because I know that you and I came to a pretty honest understanding of what that looks like. That it's, and I'm just to recap. I want you to add to this, but is that the national anthem kneeling wasn't as much about the national anthem itself and disrespecting the flag or disrespecting the anthem as it was about what it was originally intended to be, of equality and consideration.
Absolutely. You got to say it about the media at times.
Well, sure.
They absolutely will go ahead and twist and turn things. But the original protests was about equality and police brutality. I hear some of my friends in where they say that's not the right time, nor the right place. That's not the right venue. However, what is the original nature of protest? To go ahead and shine light on something, an injustice.
Right.
And oftentimes a protest is not going to be along the lines we would want it to be.
That's a good point.
So if you have that platform and you feel strongly enough about it, about an injustice going on, I will say, then for me, I can see what Colin Kaepernick was doing. Now, of course, there was other individuals that followed in kind. Some of them I don't know if that's what their motivation was for doing it, and some of them I do believe they believe the same thing. But ultimately, originally it was a protest concerning police brutality against minorities, not just African Americans, not just Latinos, but in different urban areas there is a grand level of unnecessary brutality. Matter of fact, brutality in itself is unnecessary, but against a certain people.
Well, let me ask you this, because I think our listeners are going to probably ask this question. Then, how do you hold these things in balance? How do we, as a culture, hold these things in balance where we find this appropriate time to protest? And like you're right, I agree. There's no right time to protest. It's about bringing out these injustices, and it needs to be uncomfortable at times to cause us to think and to pause and to ponder. But I don't think it's not an either or. It's a both and. It's right. And how do you hold those things into balance? How do you hold the fact that it's during a national anthem, but it's not about the national anthem. It's about what America stands. If that makes any sense. But how do we hold these things in balance without feeling like, okay, well, if we're protesting this, somehow we're negating the fact that the flag means something. But even if we're going to be truly honest, we don't sing all the national anthem.
We definitely don't, and that's another thing that came up as well. There was individuals that was asking, well, why the national anthem? Well, if we do our history concerning that specific anthem in itself, there are racial tones in there in later stanzas. Now, we don't normally sing those stanzas. However, in light of what was happening with the protest, there is that connective tissue there. And so that became something of and then there's of course other individuals out there that will debunk or attempt to debunk that the later stanzas did not necessarily speak on that. I honestly would politely disagree.
Well, and this is very interesting for me because I don't know if I've ever really thought about how there could be other stanzas of the national anthem that we don't sing, and maybe they would talk about slavery as that was an aspect of everyday life there. And maybe I'm the only one that doesn't realize that there are other stanzas.
Well, I don't think so. And as you're looking that up, Shayne, I want to mention too is that to our listeners, we're going to talk about this in later podcasts or maybe sooner podcasts. I don't remember when we talked about this, but we'll talk about it greater, in further length about the idea that just because we disagree doesn't mean that we lack honor or respect. Right. And I think that's where I think a lot of the media has polarized this is that one side of the media says that you're protesting during the national anthem and somehow you're dishonoring or disrespecting the flag of the national anthem. Yeah. And I think just because we don't agree doesn't mean that honor and respect are out the door. Just because there was a protest about police brutality doesn't mean that somehow we've lost sight of honoring the position of a police officer or the respect of that authority. Right. It's we get so caught up in the desire to be black and white, and there's very, very rarely, it's not very, very black and white. It's very gray in how we look at this, and so it's that how do we navigate that well? So did you find it or?
I did. It's the third one, as a matter of fact. So we all typically go by the first one, but about the Star Spangled Banner, of course, you got to consider from the context and when it was originally written and what was going on in our country at that particular time. But the particular portions in there that speaks about it, a home and a country should leave us no more. Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of grave. There's definitely slave connotations in there, and who are we specifically speaking about, and what were we going to do with them if they were caught? And so this background there, and I don't put that out there at all in any insensitive way, but definitely, again, let's talk about it. What is this about, and can we have these conversations?
Well, that's why I want to encourage our listeners right now who might be like, oh, that didn't feel good. Like, okay, what are you going to do with that? Maybe it's not meant to feel good. It's meant to cause you to pause and to think. Right. Now, No, come with, do your research.
Right.
Ask your questions, explore it. Don't just go, well, that was just stupid, and I don't agree with that at all.
Right.
Which I think is sometimes we do because we don't want to engage those conversations. And so for our listeners, maybe listen to this, both parts of this topic again, and just reflect on it, and ask yourself. We talk about this in the first couple episodes, right, Trevor? How do we reflect on it? What kind of self-awareness? How do we come to the conversation with vulnerability and honesty, but also humility?
Right.
The humility piece is huge, and I think as we go over the national anthem, recognizing that for me is such an acknowledgement of the negative and terrible things that have happened in our history as a nation and as humanity, and that we will talk about this later on. That I'm not responsible for what happened before I was born, but I am responsible for what I'm doing now.
Yeah.
And part of what I desire to do is have these conversations in a positive way, where I can hopefully turn the tide so that the future generations look back and see that some of these wrongs were righted.
Right. Either righted, corrected, at least addressed. There's sometimes people out there will say something and not necessarily know the context or the history about it. And then when it's addressed, we're immediately turned off or turned away as not knowing what we're talking about. Let's talk about it.
I do think this is going to turn into a 3-part series, because I do want to talk about what you just brought up, Trevor, and I don't know, we don't have enough time today in today's podcast to do it, but really talking about that, the term white privilege. And I know there's a lot of people that are going to be listening that it's going to go, ooh, and it shouldn't, at least for me, I want to be able to explain kind of how I've worked through that, and you and I can have a dialogue around that, but I'd love to have Shayne a part of that.
Absolutely. I would love to.
Because it's not bad. No. It's in some ways just what is, and how do we navigate through that? So, Shayne, I really appreciate you, your honesty, your vulnerability, and coming to this conversation. And for our listeners too, this is just a little bit of a taste of kind of the conversations we're going to be having over this next season. Right. And so, I really would encourage you to hang with us and deepen and broaden your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Please join us next week. I believe that we will be talking about respect and honor, and we will be continuing this conversation with Shayne, hopefully in the future.
Thank you for joining Candid Conversations. If you would like more information, go to mayfieldcounseling.com/candid conversations and check out our Facebook page, Candid Conversations with Dr. Mayfield.